Shall we resume? I suggested in the paper that I delivered yesterday morning that the thesis of the moral standing of states was one of the cornerstones of Michael Walzer's thought, the thread that united works as early as Just and Unjust Wars with Spheres of Justice and with works as late as Nation and Universe, Thick and Thin, and On Toleration. So I was very pleased to see that the organizers decided that the thesis of the moral standing of states was a topic of sufficient weight and importance to warrant a panel, and a very distinguished panel of its own in this conference. Against the local norms of the conference, but in accordance with my own sense of propriety, since I know not everyone has the big binders, I will briefly introduce each of our speakers. We will hear first from Ruth Gavison, who is a senior fellow emeritus at the Israel Democracy Institute. She was a founding member of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and was for many years chairperson and president. She is a member of the International Commission of Jurists. We'll hear next a paper from Charles Beitz, professor of politics at Princeton University, editor of Philosophy and Public Affairs, and the author of work including the important book Political Theory and International Relations. And our commentator is Nancy Rosenblum, Senator Joseph S. Clark Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government and Chair of the Department of Government at Harvard University. She is the author of books including Membership and Morals, The Personal Uses of Pluralism in America. Professor Gavison.
Thank you very much. It's suitable that this session is the last one, or almost the last one in this conference, because it really ties together many of the themes that we have heard about, because it's not only Michael Walzer as a scholar, engaged, connected or disconnected critic of his society, but also his special methodology, the like that he has to combine normative judgments, evaluations with descriptions, very rich descriptions, to test theories by examples taken from both history and public affairs. All this is of, I think, particular relevance to the subject we are discussing now. For me, this conference and this subject are of special importance because the title, The Moral Standing of State, is really taken from an article that Michael Walzer wrote in 1980 as a response to 4 critics of the first edition of Just and Unjust Wars. And the main criticism was that he was too deferential to states and therefore was not permissive enough, allowing more interventions in states that are tyrannical and violate the human rights of their population. One of the writers of these criticisms was my colleague here, Professor Beitz. And as a response, Walzer wrote this Moral Standing of States paper. But then when you look at Just and Unjust Wars, you see that in a very critical discussion of just war theory, he says that the moral standing of any particular state depends upon the reality of the common life it protects and the extent to which the sacrifices required by that protection are willingly accepted and thought worthwhile. So we are having here a moral justification of the standing of states with justification that is based on inclinations, on tendencies, on facts of the matter, and obviously the very, very complex connections between the moral evaluation and these facts of the matter, and the question, what happens if these facts of the matter do not exist or are partial or incomplete? These questions immediately arise. But the original context of the moral standing of state by Walzer was the theory of just and unjust wars. It's true that Walzer and his critics expand a bit, but to me, in addition to rereading Just and Unjust Wars in the context of a particular war I was studying, the moral standing of state resonated with a lot of Walzer's broader political theory, which has to discuss the relationship between politics and societies, between individuals and societies, and between states and the international order. And I think in this way, the panel that we are now at really touches on all these issues. And my general thesis is that Walzer is talking about the moral standing of states. And there is an ambiguity there about whether the special standing of states, justifying a presumption that their sovereignty should be respected by other states or other organs, whether this is only moral or prudential. And I think he himself suggests that it's both moral and prudential. I do not want to go into the details of Walzer's own thinking on this subject. I would like to advance a theory that I think endorses the theory and the presuppositions of the theory that Walzer proposes here in his more general political philosophy and political science and sociology of groups and things like that. And I want to say that we should take states seriously. And I'm saying this as an aphorism on Dworkin's taking rights seriously. And I want in particular to say that we should take states seriously in the sense that we should not subject states to particular evaluations when they violate or allegedly violate human rights of people within them. We should not act on each such evaluation, definitely not by military intervention, but not necessarily even by condemnation. In this sense, I would like to suggest that states are and should be, not only because it's inevitable that they are, not only because the world is not perfect enough to allow for global state. I think states should remain main players in our thinking about the world and its political organization. Now, why is that the case? States are instruments, unlike individuals whose autonomy is justified in part by them being a value in itself. States are not in themselves values. It doesn't follow from that that states do not have functions that are so critical to important elements of social and individual life that the existence of states, the strength of states, and the well-functioning of states are of great value. And if I'm right that only states can do very important things that we want to do, I think it follows that we should evaluate states morally, as we should evaluate everything that happens morally, but the evaluation should be complex. We shouldn't evaluate each particular action by each particular state agent and then say, this is wrong, so this should be corrected or amended. We should give states a place that will be their own, and we shall say that it's important for us as citizens and as people who live in a world that needs stability in the world, it's important for us that there be well-functioning, strong, effective states that will be the main building blocks of the international order. This is connected to themes that Walzer develops in all of his work. It's connected to the relationships between states and their populations, citizens, residents, and the relationship between states and other states, and obviously relations between states and populations of other states. The special feature of states as we know them is that states are not social creatures, but political creatures. They have an institutional structure, and what they do is they claim, hopefully effectively, a monopoly over the justified use of force within them. So you can have justification of the Hobbesian kind of why would people leave their liberties in the natural state of nature in favor of a strong state, and you may have other kinds of justifications, but basically the main function of the state is to preclude within it a state of violence among people. So the only force that can be justifiably used, more or less, is that of the state. In the international order, on the other hand, the picture usually is a picture of sovereignty, that is immunity and equality. That is, states are equal to other states in terms of sovereignty. And one of the questions is, what do we do in the international level with a state that does not perform the kinds of functions that it has towards its own population? This is, the basics of political theory. Now, I don't think that states have rights. Individuals and groups and populations and communities have rights against the states, and they have rights that the state has correlative duties towards its citizens, and the duties are important. There are duties of protection, public order, of nation building, of education, of health, of protection against enemies from outside, enforcing police order within the state. When the state, as most states are, is not a homogeneous cultural community, it's the role of the state to, A, see to it that all the human rights of individuals and groups are protected, and that there is equality from the state towards all these residents of the state, but it's also the role of the state to see to it that the relationships between the groups do not become relationships of strife or oppression or domination or genocide. So there are many, many roles that a state must make and it must perform, and it must perform them because it has the monopoly over the justified use of force. Now, if the state does not perform those obligations towards its citizens, citizens have a series of ways in which they can respond. They can protest, they can organize, they can seek to change the ways of their government, and in extreme cases, they can revolt. They can disobey the laws, civil disobedience. In extreme cases, they can revolt. And there are conditions in political theory, more or less clear, not agreed always, but there are conditions for when citizens have these rights to do these things, and they're related, of course, to the freedoms, democratic freedoms that these citizens have. The more freedom you have to fight politically in order to change an arrangement, the less freedom or right you have to revert to power to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But the point that is important here and critical to the move from this thesis to the international arena is that it's not the case that whenever citizens of the state have a right to revolt against the state, it's not the case that states have the right to intervene and enforce from the outside the change that citizens would have the right to fight for. And why this is so is a very complex question. We heard a bit about it from Michael Doyle yesterday when he talked about Mill's principle of self-determination. And I think here there is a very interesting combination of reasons that are moral and prudential, and I will not go into the details of them here. Because what I would like to move to is to a point that was raised in the rights of minority debate, and this is the question: how do we build these structures of decision-making? Because I said a state is unique because it not only has the power to decide what should be done, it has the power to act on these decisions by institutionalizing decision-making powers within the state. And the question how to structure these decision-making processes, who decides and in what processes, is an critical political question. And one important aspect of taking states seriously is the integrity, not necessarily of the products of the decisions of these decision-making mechanisms, but of the processes of decision-making themselves. And if this is something that is accepted, it goes both to the question of the rights of the citizens to determine in themselves, for themselves, not only the content of the arrangements that they are going to have, but also the identity of the people who will make the decisions and the kind of processes in which these decisions are going to be made. Now, if you want to interfere with that within a state, one of the critical questions is who decides, legislatures or courts, communities or state organs, local authorities or the state? Are we having a federal state, or are we having a unitary state? Here, the types of state typology of states that Walzer was talking about, I think is becoming critical. Because I think part of the claim is that societies are so different in their composition, in their histories, in their needs, in their traditions, that the structures of power and decision-making and the division of power between central authorities and communitarian authorities, all these things cannot be decided a priori and universally. They must be decided for the community and preferably by the community. So this applies to things within the state. This applies with greatest strength to moves from outside of the state. And here, let me divide it to some issues. We have political problems, we have problems of knowledge, on a deep level of knowledge, how to structure, and we have problem of autonomy. And I think that the strength of the presumption against intervention does not rest only on the very important need for self-determination. The presumption for non-intervention rests also on the fact that often, if you're going to have the kind of atrocity that may justify intervention, if you're going to have that kind of atrocity, the chances that you can go in, repair the damage, prevent the atrocity, and then go out again quickly, the chances that you can do that are very, very, very slim. And if you cannot do that, the meaning of your repairing this kind of problem is probably a prolonged occupation or domination of the country you were saving by yourself. So this again goes to the morality, to the prudence, to the effectiveness, and also to the rights of the people of the invading state who may be called on to save some other people, politics of rescue, but may find themselves policing a society that cannot be controlled by its own institutions, and that the delicate balance by which it was controlled was destroyed by the benevolent intervention. So what do we want the international order to look like? I think we all agree that states should not be sovereign totally. We don't want a world in which states do just what they want. And the human rights discourse is the kind of discourse that is meant to limit states. The human rights discourse is an interesting discourse because it's an international discourse, it's universal, it's indivisible, it's based on the beliefs and the values that are supposed to be universal, but nonetheless its enforcement mechanism requires to a large extent the effective mechanisms of states. International conventions of human rights do not become operative unless they are ratified by states. And the kinds of obligations that human rights international documents impose on states differ with the situations of particular states, and they will not be enforced in a colorblind, state-blind measure on all states, irrespective of their circumstances. So in this sense, human rights law, international human rights law, is an effective constraint. It's effective because it's norms that do not depend on the will of states, but its enforcement mechanism is relatively weak. Now, some people say that the fact that the enforcement mechanism of human rights is weak is a disadvantage of the international arrangement. And what we should do is strive towards a world in which there will be more effective enforcement of human rights norms on states that do not protect the human rights of their populations. And in terms of moral theory, that clearly would be a better thing, assuming that a better enforcement mechanism on the international level will yield more protection of human rights within member states. But I think that both in principle and in empirical reality, this picture is very, very unlikely to be true. Empirically, because today it's not at all clear that we can have international bodies that will be motivated not by the politicized interests of the parties that are controlling those international bodies, but by those disembodied universal precepts of human rights. We don't have that. We don't have any institution that is not politicized. So we don't know that what these states are going to enforce are really human rights norms and not their own political wishes, interests, disguised as human rights norms. But it's not only the question of real enforceability and belief that it will be more moral. The more basic problem is that the vision of a state government, or even a federalized state government, reflects a belief in the uniformity of suitability of particular solutions to particular places, societies, and states. And anyone who believes, as I do, deeply, that there are no right answers, and that it's not clear what morality dictates, not necessarily because there is no moral realism. I think within moral realism, you can still say that it's not clear what morality dictates in a particular society. In political structure, constitutional structure, the scope of rights, all of these are not clear. There is no one right answer. If there is no one right answer, then what you need to do, you must do, is to allow the political processes of the units that are the basic building units of the universe to work out their way. And what you should do as philosophers or moralists, what you should do is look at that effort. And it depends on where you stand in this effort. And there are a range of things that we can do as citizens and moral philosophers and as international NGOs to help the world move in the desirable direction. So what would these things, for instance, be? There are the things that clearly require, not permit, require intervention. The tragedy of our world is not so much that states intervene when they shouldn't, which happens too. I think there is a tragedy in our world that states do not intervene to prevent atrocities that clearly and undeniably should have been prevented. Genocide, happened, still happens in the world, and we cannot find the effective international way to prevent those massacres. So this is one thing. But the debate is really about other things. What do we do for a state that is not democratic, does not allow its citizens to participate in working out relationships? And in addition, not only is it not democratic, it doesn't give women equal status. It is a traditional society. There are minorities that are oppressed and persecuted. What do we do with a state like that? Do we just sit there and look at it? And the answer is that, A, we do not, unless some thresholds are passed, we do not invade it militarily. But there are many things that both people within that state, even if it's not democratic, can do, and if they cannot do, there are things that can be done from the outside. The language of morality can be used, must be used, should be used. It should be used in a way that will respect the need of that society to come to terms with its problems. It's going to be both more effective and more just on the whole and in the long term if we empower the dispossessed of that society to do what is needed in order to make their lives better. Our vision of the good life must resonate with their wishes for themselves. And if we are patient enough, we'll do it. When we make shortcuts, it sometimes maybe work, I don't know, sometimes it does not. But it's not only that. We can have, and we do have, many ways short of war that can affect behavior. There are international relations. There are things that we can do and we should do. But let me illustrate the kinds of complexities and the importance of statehood to peoples. Let me illustrate that by going to the state of Israel. I'm going to Israel because, A, Michael says you should usually talk about the country you know best. But I'm talking about Israel because we're celebrating Israel's 60th birthday. So Israel is a state that is very young. And for Israelis, many Israelis, Zionists, the creation of the Jewish state was a very particular goal. So they said, for us, statehood matters. Now, some claim that, in fact, this is not a justified claim. The Jewish state is not justified. So here again we have, in a nutshell, the basic question of whether it's possible in a certain state to have a state that is a nation state of one community, despite the fact that it has other indigenous communities within it. I think this is an important question. I think it's very important for this question to be thought about in Israel and outside of Israel. I think this is not the kind of question that should be decided by international lawyers, moral philosophers, or human rights NGOs. Because this is a kind of question that relates to the quality of life and the way of life of the community. Now, if the conditions within that community would have been such that you wouldn't justify an autonomy of that political community, then maybe the picture would have been different. But clearly, a state like that should see to it that it has a few conceptions of its political community, the kind of political community the states are there to protect. First of all, and really first of all, is the inclusive civic community, the community of all Israeli citizens. It's the duty of the state and the right of the citizens that the civic community be made meaningful, that the inclusive shared civic identity is rich, is something that makes people not necessarily feel that this is their most important identity, but feel that this is an important identity that they want to share. I think Israel has mixed success on that one. Now, what should Israel to do about the other communities living in it? Should Israel privatize all communities and be just a state of all its citizens? I think the answer is no. It would be an appropriate answer possibly for immigrant states. It would be an appropriate answer for civic nation states. But for the kind of state that Israel is, with its history and purpose, this would not be a right answer, and luckily not even the Arabs would like Israel to be the state of all its citizens, privatizing all non-civic identities. Should it be the state of all its nationalities? That is a multicultural, multinational, multilinguist state with equal force to all states. An interesting question, should be debated. But then the question is, should it be a binational state with a Palestinian state? Should it be just binational state? Why did Jews want statehood? Why did the United Nations in November 29th, 1947, give them statehood and not autonomy within a state? The question goes to the typology of states that Walzer draws. It depends on the relationship between the communities. If you have communities with different culture, the best way is to give all of them life within one state with cultural autonomy. That's self-determination, that human right to self-determination should then take the form of a sub-state right. Would be fine. But if you have two communities that argue about immigrations, borders, settlements, foreign policy, identity, narrative, history, and fight it out, then maybe it's possible, it's better, maybe it's the only possible way to separate these communities, put a fence between them, and make them two states. And if these two states are going to have populations of the different community, obviously the civic duty of states towards all their citizens apply. Now, here we go back to questions that we heard before. Rights of minorities, of course, rights of minorities. But rights of minorities depend not only on whether they're indigenous or other things. They depend on the nature of the relationships between the communities. Peaceful relationships, where the threat is identity or cultural, is very different from military one. So all these things show that in Israel, statehood was important. I think in Israel and many other parts of the world, statehood is important. Statehood should not be seen as the villain of the political theory, something that is coming to fight against human rights. It should be seen as a creature that we need to balance very carefully, give it effective powers to do what it must do for its communities, and make sure that we minimize the ability of the people who are holding powers within that society to abuse their power for all the communities and the individuals living within them. Thank you.
Professor Beitz.
Thanks, Jacob. I met Michael during my first year as a graduate student at Princeton. That year, academic management being what it is, all of the political theorists on the Princeton faculty were away on leave. And Michael, who was then teaching at Harvard, was brought in once a week. I always imagined by plane in a sort of, example of low-altitude bombing, to teach a graduate seminar on Hobbes. That seminar, for me, was memorable, not least for Michael's example as a meticulous and exceedingly sympathetic interpreter of Hobbes's text. I say this because, like all of us, I feel that I've learned a lot from Michael's work, but it's worth saying how much I've learned from his example as a student of the history of political philosophy, intent on making it mean something for political life in our own world. For me, at least, and I think for lots of his readers, that's been a very important example. So, as Ruth has explained, the moral standing of states is the title of a paper Michael wrote in response to 4 critics of the theory of intervention presented in Just and Unjust Wars, and as she also said, I was one of the critics. I think when I was too young to know how to be very subtle about being a critic. What I'm doing in this paper today is revisiting the subject of Michael's paper and trying to put his views about intervention, and particularly about humanitarian intervention, in the context of a wider view about global political justice, and to explore the value of collective self-determination, which is central to that view. Michael's work over the years, not just in Just and Unjust Wars and in the moral standing paper, but also in his essays, including the political essays written since the end of the Cold War, show to me both a kind of impressive consistency and a growth. The growth indicated especially by a developing internationalism that I think was implicit at the beginning, but is much more visible in things he's written in the last 15 years, and which I think, as I try to suggest in the written version, and I may not get to say much about it today, I think it is intellectually essential to the persuasiveness of the overall view in a world like ours. So the written paper has 4 parts. The first describes the controversy between Michael and the critics. The second tries to generalize from his response to a wider view about global justice. The third explores the idea of collective self-determination, the interpretation of which I think is maybe the most interesting point of theoretical disagreement or possible disagreement. And the last looks back on the controversy about moral standing with the experience of the humanitarian interventions of the last 15 or so years in mind. Our time is limited, and so I'm going to concentrate just on the second and third of these with a very brief comment about the first and an even briefer comment about the last. So first, about the controversy between Michael and the 4 critics, I'll just make one summary comment since Ruth has said much of what needs to be said. As Michael Doyle reminded us yesterday, Michael Walzer argues in Just and Unjust Wars that coercive intervention in the internal affairs of states is forbidden except in 3 kinds of cases: when it would support a secessionist movement, when it would contest a prior intervention, and when it would put an end to acts that shock the moral conscience of mankind, in his phrase. Although the examples he gives in the book are enslavement and massacre, and I think in the paper he adds mass expulsion as the 3 major classes of acts that might justify humanitarian intervention. Those are presented as exceptions to the conventional view of the jus ad bellum, which Michael calls in the book the legalist paradigm. And he argued that we need the revisions to make the paradigm consistent with its own rationale. One has to sort of have some experience of the international thought of the 60s and 70s to realized that this was a progressive view in its own time when the idea of humanitarian intervention for any purpose was looked at with some suspicion. So it's understandable that one would have been surprised by the criticism that came from Michael's four critics, because what we argued was that the view wasn't progressive enough. The common position, as Ruth put it, was that the revisions wouldn't allow intervention in some kinds of cases when a government's conduct was bad enough to undermine its claim to legitimacy, but didn't descend to the level of enslavement or massacre. So in effect, although not exactly these words, we accused Michael of a kind of fetishism of sovereignty, of allowing it an importance beyond what our reasons for caring about it would justify. And Moral Standing, the paper, is a response to that critique. Michael argues in the paper, and again Ruth has summarized the position nicely, that there's a difference between the judgment that citizens of a state are called upon to make about their own government and the judgment that's open to outsiders. Citizens have to judge whether their government's legitimate because they're the ones who have to decide whether to obey it or to resist. Outsiders, on the other hand, face a different problem. They need to decide how to conduct their relationship with the government and the society it governs, and for that purpose, the question they should ask is whether they should presume the government to be legitimate. And the argument made in the paper is that in all but the most, that is in Michael's paper, is that in all but the most extreme cases, that presumption of legitimacy is morally necessary. He gives several reasons, which I try to itemize in the written version of this for the claim, but I think the most important is that people have rights to participate in a collective process of determining the character of their political and social lives. The state organizes that process by instituting and protecting a government, and the presumption of legitimacy by outsiders is necessary to respect those individual rights to participate in a self-determining society. In the book, Michael describes these rights as Michael describes the social contract as a metaphor for the process in which people exercise these rights over time. Well, I think Michael was right to suggest in the Moral Standing paper that none of the critics, and I'm sure he was right to suggest this about me, had thought hard enough about self-determination as a distinctive value in international life to be able to see clearly where the point of disagreement arose. So I'm going to come back and try to talk more about that subject a little bit later. But first, before I get to it, I want to turn to the more general picture of global political justice that's implied by Michael's view about the basis and reach of non-intervention. And I do this because I think the picture, especially as it develops in some of the later papers, is more distinctive than might be clear from its presentation in the book itself. And I think my original, the comments in my original paper missed the distinctiveness. In the longer paper, I try to bring out the distinctiveness by drawing a contrast between Michael's view and the classical society of states conception of global justice. Michael uses that phrase too in the book. It's a phrase that I think for both of us, the source of which for both of us is Hedley Bull, that's found in the line of natural law writers from Grotius to Christian Wolff. And I think most clearly in Wolff, who shows the least ambivalence about the application of the domestic analogy to international relations and the resulting strong interpretation of sovereignty. And through Vattel, who regarded himself as Wolff's principal disciple, it's a view that had I think, very important influence on the international thought of the Enlightenment and much of the 19th century, including the American founders for whom Vattel was sort of the author of the principal textbook of international law. The view that we find in Wolff, and like the legalist paradigm that Michael describes, but without the revisions, is essentially a theory about the conditions for a just coexistence among states. It's the legacy of the reorganization of the political system of Europe at the conclusion of the religious wars, and the central principle of non-interference is best understood as a requirement of mutual toleration. But it's not a toleration that particularly values or celebrates the integrity of communities of culture. International toleration for these writers was quite explicitly a modus vivendi. It was a necessary condition of peace. And in this respect, the conception of world order found in the UN Charter, in which territorial integrity and political sovereignty are fundamental, is not materially different. It's a conservative conception tending to perpetuate the political status quo. What makes that conservatism possible is the fact that these classical theorists lack the idea that the state encloses and organizes a social entity that can be identified independently of its political organization. I mean, in terms of its history and its traditions and the norms and social practices that its members share. For the classical writers, the 17th and 18th century writers, the authors of the Society of States idea, the nation is a collective agent, and it can be distinguished analytically from the government, but it's not assumed to have any particular social character or to be capable of existing apart from the state. And in fact, Wolff says explicitly that when the state is broken up, the nation just disappears. It just disappears. On the other hand, in the revisionist view that we have from Michael, the most basic elements are not political entities, but social ones. They're communities, nations, or peoples, maybe. Those are the primary constituents of global society. The world political order is a way of organizing the underlying social order so that its constituent groups can exercise their capacities as collective agents to direct their own futures. The underlying principle in this view, as Michael puts it in his discussion of Mill, the discussion that Michael Doyle talked about yesterday, the underlying principle is this, and I quote from Michael Walzer here: always act so as to recognize and uphold communal autonomy. That's not a politically conservative principle, because it could justify, not politically conservative, because it could justify rearranging the political order if that were necessary to conserve or to protect the underlying social order of communities, and that's just the kind of problem Ruth was describing at the end. I think that's an important, looked at theoretically, that's an important and quite fundamental departure from the classical Society of States view, and it points toward a distinctive conception of global political justice. It's a conception that's mostly implicit in Just and Unjust Wars. It's made more explicit in Moral Standing, and in some more recent papers, in particular Michael's essays Nation and Universe and The Politics of Difference, we begin to see the shape of this alternative view. I describe it in the written papers because it needs some label as a society of people's view, but not in the Rawlsian sense. It's not a society of states, it's a society of social entities that I think it would be ambiguous to call nations, so I call peoples. But that's a different view. And without trying to describe the whole picture, I wanted to just try to list three ideas that seem to me sort of central to that view. And the first is about the nature of our social world. It's a world of communities, of nations and usually, but more generally, peoples. And each community is the locus of a common life in which, as Michael puts it in one of the later papers, human creativity expresses itself in a shared morality, culture, including a political culture, and in some cases, religion. The second idea concerns the political organization of that world. The primary political form in that world is the territorial national state, although under some historical circumstances, the multinational or the immigrant state. The state, through a structure of government, makes it possible for a community to determine its own future by organizing its processes of political decision-making and protecting them against outside interference. And then the third idea is about the global order composed of these politically organized communities and the political problem that sort of a global order poses. And here is a kind of application of the domestic analogy, I think. The exercise of human creativity simultaneously in many different communities produces inevitably a plural world, with its plurality expressed in differing moralities, cultures, sometimes religions, and ideas of political legitimacy. And in that plural world, a central political problem is to manage the pluralism and the inevitable conflicts it's likely to generate. And there again, the relevant principle is one of mutual toleration, but it's not the mutual toleration of the classical writers. It's toleration among political communities, not, as in the first instance, among states. And here the key point is that the toleration's not a modus vivendi. It's a way of expressing respect for the pluralism that results from the expression of human creativity. And in this connection, Michael quotes Isaiah Berlin on Herder. He says, this is quoting Berlin, he did not see why one community absorbed in the development of its own native talent should not respect similar activity on the part of others. The principle of toleration in this view, what I've called the Society of Peoples view, is a much more substantial principle of toleration than the modus vivendi view that that, as in at the domestic level, that was characteristic of the late 17th and 18th centuries. So I think those are three essential ideas in this view that I'm attributing to Michael, attributing with some reservations, because I think he probably doesn't like to have systematic views like this attributed to him. But I should probably add a fourth idea to these three. It's barely discernible in the book, but I think it's prominent in some recent articles, which I have to say, in rereading, I came to appreciate the consistency of the overall view. And the fourth idea is this: it's that international society has an emergent superstructure that consists of international institutions and norms, including norms of human rights, as well as transnational associations of individuals and groups, maybe the beginnings of a sort of global civil society. And that makes available new political possibilities, and they include the possibility, to use a phrase that Michael uses, of the global enforcement of human rights, of which he suggests humanitarian intervention might be the first example. This is in his paper, Beyond Humanitarian Intervention. Reading the papers in the order in which they were written, you might think that this is a late development and it could look like a kind of afterthought, but I think actually it's essential to the persuasiveness of the whole conception, for a reason I'll just touch on later. So this is crude and it's incomplete, but I hope it'll be clear that even without the last point, these ideas describe a substantially and not just marginally different conception of global justice than the Society of States view. It's a much more, I think of this much more as the sort of a characteristically 19th century view, much more clearly identified with Mill, say, than an Enlightenment or pre-Enlightenment view. These points raise what more or less obvious large questions, most of which I'm not going to be able to talk about. They're both moral ones and empirical ones. Here I just want to comment on one of the moral questions, and then I'll end with sort of 3 sentences about an empirical question. So the moral questions about self-determination. I think that a main, if not the main reason why this Society of People's view of global justice might seem appealing is that it's constructed in order to protect the value of collective self-determination. But it's the idea of self-determination is famously unclear. It's hard to say what it amounts to, and it's hard to say why we should care about it. There's one clear point, but it only serves to refine the problem, and that's this. Self-determination, the phrase, has at least 2 clearly distinct senses, which we could call external or outward-looking and internal or inward-looking. Thought of in the first or external sense, it just is another way of talking about a state's legal and political autonomy looked at in relation to the wider world. It's not the sense that's interesting here, because nothing obviously follows from it about the internal character of a regime. But that's not true of internal self-determination. To say that a state's self-determining in this sense is to say something about the relationship between a people and a state. As a first, although not a very helpful approximation, a people is internally self-determining only when that relationship with the state has a certain feature. It's, we might say, the relationship is that the state apparatus enables the people to govern itself. But as I say, that's not very helpful because the idea of self-government is not much clearer than the idea of self-determination. And to see the ambiguity, I want to just sort of distinguish very quickly 3 different interpretations of the idea of internal self-determination, and then say sort of something about which of these are reasons for caring about self-determination should point us towards. At one end of the range, which let's say the maximalist end, self-determination requires institutions that are in some generic sense democratic. It's a kind of natural thought once we notice that a people is composed of individual persons, and that a distinguishing feature of democratic institutions just is that they have a mechanism through which individual members acting together can control political outcomes. So there's an obvious sense in which we could say that people, the members of a democracy, govern themselves. The conception of legitimacy and moral standing and in Just and Unjust Wars lies at the other, I'll call it the minimalist end, though there may be a sub-minimalist end that I haven't noticed, but lies at the minimalist end of the range. And according to that conception, a people is self-determining, to use Michael's phrase, if it's governed in accordance with its own traditions or if the government fits its political culture. Now, to say it's minimalist is not to say the view's toothless. I mean, it requires there to be a fit between the people and the state, so it's not just external self-determination by another name. But there isn't any independent requirement that institutions should offer members of the group opportunities to influence outcomes. If the political culture were in some way authoritarian or aristocratic, and if the form of government conformed to the culture's political norms, that would be enough to say that fit exists. I think in that sort of case, individual members could be said to control outcomes only in a sense that's at least once removed from the actual process of governance, by acquiescing in or anyway not forcibly resisting the authority of the government. They allow its decisions to take hold, and by fighting for the state, assuming that they do fight for the state, they protect it against interference from the outside. But that's not self-government in any obvious sense. Then there's intermediate possibilities that are also that we can also imagine, and I just want to mention one that is suggested by John Rawls's idea of a decent consultation hierarchy in the Law of Peoples. Rawls's idea is that a society could be self-determining if its political institutions are set up, this is my gloss, not his, set up so that outcomes track a widely shared conception of the common good that takes into account the good of each individual member of society. And there are various ways that that could happen. Rawls's notion of a consultation hierarchy is one where institutions provide opportunities for everybody, maybe organized in associations, to articulate their interests, to express dissent in public, and to demand that public officials explain themselves in terms of the shared conception of the common good. Now, this is obviously not democracy. I mean, people can express their interests and articulate dissent, but their institutions don't allow them to exercise any formal control over outcomes. But equally plainly, this intermediate interpretation excludes the kind of unaccountable authoritarianism that I was suggesting earlier seems compatible with the minimalist view. It's an intermediate position. It imposes a formal condition on a society's political structure, which is meant to require that that outcomes track a widely shared idea of the common good that takes account of everybody's interests. And for that reason, I think we could reasonably call this a kind of self-government, even though it's not any kind of democracy. So the question is, which of these, to put it sort of polemically, which of these ideas is really self-determination? That's, I think, clearly a question that we don't answer by consulting ordinary usage. I mean, we couldn't anyway, because ordinary usage is not clear enough, but we shouldn't in any case, because self-determination is a normative idea, and the meaning we attach to it should be responsive to the reasons why we care about it. So I need to say something about the reasons we should care about self-determination, and that's a complicated question, and I can only sort of advance a sort of schematic reply without the argument that it needs. And so here it is. Self-determination is a property of collectivities, but we value it for its significance for individuals. And that significance seems to have at least three different dimensions. One is strategic. Well-functioning, self-determining communities offer the best prospects of any political form that's practically available of protecting people's basic interests as the people themselves understand them. So this is a familiar element of Mill's argument for representative government, but I think it applies more widely. Second dimension we might call developmental, and Ruth has said something about this too. Well-functioning political communities require a range of political capacities among their people, competent state institutions, a certain density of associational life, fairly wide acceptance of common political norms, and it's the nature of these features is such that they develop effectively through a historical process that takes place within a society in ways that are compatible with a larger culture. And as Michael Doyle argued yesterday, that too is a Millian argument. And then finally, self-determination has a constitutive significance. People who grow up and live in a culture tend to identify with it. They tend to regard themselves as sharing a common status with others and to approve of and follow the society's norms. The society shapes their goals and it informs their judgments of individual and social good. And so people tend to value their identification with the group for its own sake. And there's a wonderful article by Avishai Margalit and Joseph Raz on self-determination is very good on this point. So I mean this sort of list of reasons to be in the spirit of Michael's own views about self-determination, but there's no reason why somebody who shares the cosmopolitan inclinations of his critics should resist an account account that goes along these lines. And that should be stressed in particular about the third dimension. I mean, the fact that a political culture constitutes a locus of identification for members of the culture, provided that it actually does, is itself a matter of some moral importance, and interference with outsiders that disrupts the life of that culture would have real cost, and it ought to register in any calculus that tries to take people's prospects into account. So let me return just briefly to the three interpretations. We want an interpretation of self-determination that's sensitive to our reasons for taking an interest in it. And if I'm right about those reasons, then it seems to me that we ought to reject the maximal or democratic interpretation as overreaching. I mean, not all political cultures are democratic. So that interpretation could come into conflict with the third or the constitutive dimension of significance. And given the availability of this intermediate view that I tried to sketch, which is, you might say, self-government without democracy, we're not forced to the maximalist view by concerns about respect for individual interests or for basic human rights. And we could add as an empirical conjecture that under favorable conditions, for example, when a community lacks deep divisions that establish enduring animosities, decisions in a self-governing but non-democratic society are likely to treat with respect everybody's basic interests, in part because institutions provide a mechanism for people to hold public officials accountable to the common good. But that can't be said about the minimalist interpretation that I've identified with the view of self-determination in just and unjust wars, and more prominently in moral standing. That interpretation, although it responds to the constitutive dimension, leaves the features of a society's political institutions and processes entirely to one side. And so there's no basis for any sort of expectation about the character or the quality of political decisions or the likelihood that they'll respect people's basic rights or protect their basic interests. And so I don't think Michael would disagree. He recognizes it when he observes that authoritarian rule, as he puts it, might come, as it were, naturally as the expression of a conception of legitimate government in some culture. But the question here is whether our reasons for valuing self-determination in the general case are reasons for respecting the autonomy of a state whose institutions are of that kind, that don't afford opportunities for its people to participate in their own government when the state fails to respect or protect the basic interests of a significant portion of the population. And I think that's where, I said earlier I was going to try to identify the point of disagreement. I think that's where the critics part company with the position that's taken in moral standing. Some of them maybe would have parted company earlier. I can't speak for them. But what I've tried to suggest is that the fundamental issue here is a difference about the weight to be given to various kinds of reasons to care about self-determination. Michael's inclined to give more weight to considerations about cultural identity, regardless of its content, whereas the critics are more concerned about the overall impact of political decisions on individual well-being, in which cultural identity plays a role, but only a role and not the same role for each person. And that difference about the weight of interests, of course, translates into different notions of what self-determination must mean if we're to consider it a value of moral importance. So I have one last paragraph. My own view is that the interpretation of self-determination that fits best with the reasons I spoke about earlier isn't the minimalist view or the maximalist view. It's one that lies someplace in this intermediate space. May not be Rawls's view exactly, which I think is in some respects not quite right, but it's somewhere in that region. I agree that it's a mistake to think that a principle of self-determination operating at the international level includes a requirement that everybody's institutions should be democratic, but it seems to me that a conception of self-determination worthy of international respect should have an active dimension. The institutions of a self-determining state should place its members in a position to influence their own collective destiny. There should be some way that they can participate in directing their society's future in ways that don't require them to risk their lives. The self-determination that's achieved in the minimalist alternative, where the form of government accords with the history and traditions of a culture, but individuals may participate in their own self-government only in this negative sense of refraining from protest or rebellion, that seems to me too passive to engage the reasons why we should care about self-determination in the first place. And just to be clear, I don't think this leads to doctrine of sort of, indiscriminate intervention in other societies. There's lots of reasons not to intervene in societies that aren't matters of the moral standing of states. I just claim that the moral value of states, seen as embodiments of processes of collective self-determination, doesn't give us particularly good reasons to refrain from intervening in states that fall at this minimalist end of the range. So I've gone on too far, so if I could, I just want to say a sentence in conclusion about the fourth topic I said I was going to leave aside. This is about the moral status of states looked at with the interventions of the last 15 years in view, and I say this because Michael's political essays are so interesting on this. As he's observed, the experience of those interventions shows that the circumstances in which humanitarian intervention might be justified are likely to occur considerably more often than he and probably most people assumed at the time that Just and Unjust Wars was written. The way I put it in my own paper is to say that the world we actually inhabit deviates more substantially and in more ways from the background that's assumed in the conception of global political justice that I've attributed to Michael. I don't think those deviations give us reason to abandon the conception. I mean, there might be some other reasons, but I don't think they argue against it. But they do suggest it will take a lot of work to get from here to there, including probably further challenges that can only be met by humanitarian military intervention. And as Michael has suggested in the most recent of these essays I've read, and I agree completely, in doing that work, a robust form of internationalism will be essential and not just optional. And that's why the fourth of the three ideas that I said made up his conception of global political justice is essential. Thank you.
Well, Chuck said an autobiographical word, and I guess I will too. I took my first course in political theory when I was 17 with Michael Walzer, Gov 1061, and he was also the advisor for my misguided senior honors thesis on Hegel's phenomenology of mind. It was not misguided not because of the guide, but because, to use the terminology of this panel, I felt I had immunity from intervention. And it is an example of the necessity for coercive intervention even in academic life. All right, let me begin by saying that my colleague, Bob Beitz, opens his book on Africa, When Things Fell Apart, with this quote: "Working in Uganda in the early 1980s, I came to learn what it meant to live in a world of violence. Among the reasons my colleagues in the Ministry of Cooperatives welcomed the overthrow of Idi Amin was that with Uganda no longer a pariah state, they could now attend international conferences. And among the reasons they attended such conferences was that they could then sleep, for they need not fear the arrival of soldiers in the night." Well, I begin with that quote not only because it should make us feel lucky that we come to conferences for reasons other than to be able to sleep, or because Beitz's economic fieldwork really does remind me of the sort of moral fieldwork that both Professors Gavison and Beitz and Professor Walzer do. I mean, they really are attuned to events and institutions and the whole press of the actual on theory. They do an empirical ethics. And my one disappointment with these two papers was that there were fewer examples and cases than is normal for them and than I would have liked. But finally, I begin with this Beitz quote on When Things Fell Apart, because he really alerts us to the problem of failed states that I want to raise, and whether there isn't another ground for humanitarian intervention besides just massacres on the one hand and severely divided states that can't really count as states with moral standing on the other. The paper's theme is the moral standing of states and how it bears on the question of humanitarian intervention, and that's the question because the moral standing of states functions in Walzer's work as a principle of restraint on external interference in the life of a political community. And both of these authors is sympathetic to Walzer's caution against overenthusiastic human rights discourse and exuberant invocations of the obligation to intervene apart from cases of massacre or enslavement or ghastly shocks to conscience. Professor Gavison agrees with Walzer and gives human rights a very narrow, thin meaning, that's her quote. Professor Beitz subscribes to a more expansive account of human rights, but he's a judicious trimmer when it comes, I think, to employing these more expansive grounds as grounds for coercive intervention in practice, because also at work in both of these papers is a grim appreciation of the political limitations of coercive intervention. Cruelty, discrimination, and worse, inhumanity are not new. What is new is a political machinery, including international institutions and civil society groups, for monitoring and constraining and sometimes punishing, but much less for correcting. And what the panelists like Walzer are alert to is what coercive outsiders can't do even when their motives are innocent and their actions justified, and which they too seldom doubt. I mean, there are problems of knowledge, what works for a particular society, problems of commitment, the capacity to sustain an intervention, and the vicissitudes and costs. There are intractable conditions, and Michael Doyle, I thought, talked about them eloquently yesterday. So humanitarian intervention is a different order than short-term humanitarian assistance. And in fact, the difficulty of humanitarian intervention do more work than the moral standing of states in inhibiting interventions in the world. In both papers, then, the substantial divergence from Walzer comes less in the weight of human rights claims or the difficulty of affecting them than in how they understand and modify Walzer's notion of the moral standing of state as a constraint. Professors Gavison and Beitz agree that Walzer's primary argument for the moral standing of states is the right of political communities to self-determination. For Walzer, moral standing is based on the presumption of a fit between peoples and government. It depends upon the reality of the common life it protects. Now, Professor Gavison wants to step back from this moral ground as the sole presumption for state immunity, because she argues that the moral standing of states rooted in self-determination is liable to be misused to protect states too much and too little. And here I would have liked some examples from her because it wasn't clear to me which way it operated, when, and why. In any case, she substitutes something she calls taking states seriously, which operates against intervention even if there are moral and human rights reasons to intervene. Well, what does taking states seriously put in the balance? Exercising a monopoly of justified force within territories, states can secure public order, which is a condition for securing other aspects of welfare, among them economic growth, and even perhaps human rights. Professor Gavison is eloquent on the need for an effective monopoly of force and the functions it allows states to perform. She wants political theorists to think about states the way political scientists look upon the organs of domestic government. States need power to perform their functions as much as they need checks to prevent abuse. The error of constitutionalism is its exclusive focus on limitations, and human rights discourse with its focus on constraints and tendency to subject every action of states to separate and moral evaluation can distract from these basic needs and brute facts. And we can understand Professor Gavison's vehemence if we see that to her mind there are no alternatives for the provision of these goods. It's clear to her that the international community cannot and will not perform these functions, and it's not obvious that she thinks that it's reformable, and equally incapable are sub-state groups and associations which she said, when they are in a state of nature, because she is willing to give sub-state groups and associations functions of provision within functioning states, even if the provisions they provide are differential, so long as they're respectable. So she says there are reasons for counseling, taking states seriously, even for states that do not have the right to demand our deference. She subscribes then, I think, to the legalist paradigm, not entirely reconstructed, since she approves of international courts for some purposes, but she invokes sovereignty and rejects this model of the society of peoples that Professor Beitz summarizes and tries to invoke. I'm going to return to this question of the state as provider in just a moment, but for now I want to note that in her discussion of taking states seriously, in addition to talking about the effectiveness of states, she adds that they should have a legitimacy of the monopoly of justified force, a legitimacy of the monopoly of justified force. And it's not clear to me what legitimacy means here or what work it does in her thinking. Does considerations of legitimacy bring us back to the moral standing of states? Is legitimacy related to self-determination and a shared sense of affiliation? And without clarification on this point, I can't tell just how much taking states seriously subtracts from the moral standing of states as a guide to immunity from intervention. It seems at times to subtract almost everything. Now, Professor Beitz, in contrast, goes with self-determination as the basis for the moral standing of states. And he says even those like himself with cosmopolitan inclinations can appreciate the central value of collective self-determination, where the key is a fit between a people or community and its government. And it's reflected in his notion of a society of peoples versus a society of states. And I'll be very interested to hear whether Michael would subscribe to this view. On the one hand, the society of peoples does seem to capture the deep normative structure that he describes. On the other hand, a society of states retains barriers. Will he stick with Ruth or go with Chuck? I'd be curious to hear. The puzzle, in any case, for Professor Beitz is the fact that for Walzer, humanitarian intervention isn't justified when governments fail to satisfy local standards of legitimacy, to govern in accordance with their own traditions, when they deviate from fit. And Professor Beitz asks why. Are there reasons for valuing self-determination in general Also reasons for accepting state autonomy when self-determination is truncated or absent. Why should states retain their moral standing? That is immunity from intervention. And to assist in assessing this, he tries to interpret self-determination. And Professor Beitz proposes a spectrum ranging from generic democratic self-government at one end to minimalist government in accordance with its own traditions on the other. He also identifies and uses in his work an intermediate type where institutions allow people to articulate interests, express political dissent, and require public officials to give a public account of their decisions in terms of shared conceptions of the public good. I notice, and you may, if you read the text, that he seems to move from governments that give an account to governments that are accountable, though these two things may be quite different. And it's unclear to me what sort of politics his intermediate state would require. At any event, the conclusion he reaches is that democracy is not the only conception of self-determination worthy of international protection. And states that allow their members in some sense to, and I'm quoting here, influence their destiny suffice to merit this immunity. And why? And they suffice, I believe, for Professor Beitz, because these intermediate regimes have institutions that cause government decisions to track some shared idea of the common good. He says there's an empirical likelihood that this middle-range self-determination tracks well-being and human rights. Well, with this exploration of self-determination, Professor Beitz locates his 2 points of divergence from Walzer. Of the reasons to value self-determination, Walzer appears to give weight to cultural identity over the impact of political decisions on individual well-being, and Professor Beitz argues the concern for self-determination shouldn't win out when that's not justified, when it doesn't satisfy other reasons for valuing it, in particular, satisfying basic interests. Moreover, as you just heard, where Walzer sees self-determination as a value to be respected, as a constraint, Professor Beitz sees it as a value to be promoted. He says to foster that kind of statehood, and this could mean this intermediate version, may not entail intervention, but that's an empirical question, and it may be the trusteeship is required. And still, I have a question then for Professor Beitz. Is he recognizing two separate grounds for potential intervention? Well-being, on the one hand, and governments that give a public accounting, or in his words, opportunity for participation in ways that do not require people to risk their lives, or in his mind are these things linked? So that the key here is ability to influence your collective destiny for the sake of at least basic provisions or welfare. And this brings me to my concluding point. Both papers, with Professor Gavison's with her focus on state functions and Professor Beitz with his tie between self-determination and well-being, point in a direction that echoes, I think, the earlier themes of welfare and on a state's obligations to its own members and the larger question of humanitarian intervention. And it asks whether there might be constraints, whether the moral standing of states operates as a constraint in cases other than the two that have been discussed so far. One is violence, massacre, in which the moral standing of states is overridden, and the other is when the state is so divided and is so discriminatory and so unjust towards some part of its population that it makes a mockery of the idea of a single community. Professor Beitz, I think, very wisely focused, at least in his paper, if not in his remarks, on what are the actual problems today that challenge us when it comes to intervention, and I think that there's one that's been unmentioned so far and that's raised by these papers, and that is the question of state failure when it comes to provision. I think this relates quite directly to Michael Walzer's work. He's consistently insistent on the welfare functions of states. He says, political community for the sake of provision, provision for the sake of community, the process works both ways, and that's perhaps its crucial feature. In one of his most famous quotes, membership is important because of what the members of a political community owe to one another and to no one else or to no one else in the same degree, and the first thing they owe is the communal provision of security and welfare. Some goods are needed absolutely and universally, but Walzer is emphatic. Despite the inherent forcefulness of the word, needs are elusive, and he takes us on his journey of distributive justice. The nature of a need is not self-evident. For one thing, we don't know how it relates to other needs, how much of it we owe one another, and more important, needs are elusive because differences of interest draw its strength from history, culture, and religion. That is, welfare addresses socially recognized needs whose forms are as wildly varied as human imagination. And he also says distributions are not arguments about individual rights. They are arguments about the character of a particular political community. and therefore intervention to restore distributions according to our own understanding of need are not justified. Now, Professor Beitz would at first seem to agree that a falling off of governance in accordance with the community's own traditions, in this case, understanding of its needs, doesn't ordinarily endanger members' lives and liberties, and that intervention is justified only if the offenses transcend local political morality. That is, if they are a question of individual rights. And I'm asking this question because, of course, that happens. When Walzer says that every political community is in principle a welfare state, it's a sober acknowledgement of unfaithfulness to this charge, not just the indifference of rulers who don't promote the welfare of their people or corrupt rulers who skim, but outright predators who prefer exploitation, which is supported by their monopoly of violence, to stewardship, when governments become, in effect, private enterprises. Myanmar's failure to provide is in the context of a natural disaster, an emergency, but there are many others where it's an ordinary, not an extraordinary occurrence. And so my question for Professors Gavison and Beitz and Michael Walzer are whether standards of care, some sort of responsibility to protect, or some dimension of carelessness or deliberate withholding are also grounds for intervention. That is beyond humanitarian assistance to intervention. Professor Gavison interprets Walzer to say that the scope of the liberty of a state does not depend on the extent to which it meets obligations towards their own, but Walzer seems to indicate that these obligations might become a matter of justice and perhaps intervention if responsibility for this need is well established. Yesterday, at yesterday's panel, he spoke of failed states, but once again, only in the context of terms of violence. What about the failure to provide, which is common enough? Perhaps it shouldn't matter whether this sort of failed state fits within the category of a divided society, so that the moral standing of states prohibition doesn't apply, or whether it is one nation, but it can be overridden. All I'm trying to do here is add one category to the category of miseries that may merit intervention. And the question then is intervention justified? Is it morally mandatory? We often say that humanitarian aid is a moral obligation, but is humanitarian intervention an obligation when it's ongoing? Looking back to the last panel, of course, there's no solidarity to motivate here. There's only common humanity and the notion of need, which is inevitably feeble, enfeebled even more, or often just eclipsed by the anticipation, as we've seen, that interventions to provide are like interventions to stop violence, most often likely to fail. Thank you.
This one I won't reintroduce.
Chuck Beitz wondered or thought that I might be unhappy about his view to give a systematic account of my views over time, and I have no quarrel with the idea of a systematic account, especially when someone else does it. And I'm not quite sure whether this is a systematic account of my views. I couldn't give a systematic account of my own views. Over time, I now realize that I probably should have reread The Moral Standing of States before writing some of my more recent pieces. The notion of a society of peoples has some appeal to me, and it does in a certain way reflect my views, but I also believe very strongly that peoples need states. And there are so many examples in the world. Nancy complained about the lack of examples, so I will start providing some examples. The Armenians needed a state, the Jews needed a state, the Palestinians need a state, the Kurds probably need a state or some functional equivalent of a state. And these needs have a great urgency, and they mean that the focus on peoples cannot stop short of a focus on states, and this is the process of I think we need to think about this process. So you have a national liberation movement and a national liberation movement implies a nation, a people, struggling for their own liberation, which means for their own collective self-determination, and this national liberation movement produces a state. And then the people who have collectively determined that they should have a state of this sort find themselves in a state where they have fellow citizens who are not part of the people who self-determined that there should be this state. So statehood brings a more inclusive identity than peoplehood, and that's a very important an important feature of our contemporary world. The state exists to, let's say, to advance the interests of a community, of a people. The Norwegians separated from Sweden in 1903 or something like that because they were afraid of losing their Norwegianness, losing their language, losing their history. And Norway is a little engine for the reproduction of Norwegianness. But that's not all it is, because not everybody in Norway is a Norwegian. And the state has, therefore, to have other purposes and to have a more inclusive sense of its own purpose. And its purpose is to protect all the communities within it and all the individuals within it, and sometimes to protect individuals against their own communities. And it has to do all of those things, and we need it to do all of those things. And so even if we start with a society of peoples, we will end with a society of states. I do want with Ruth to take those states seriously. And that does mean that I still have the anxieties about intervention that I had in the 70s when I was writing Just and Unjust Wars. But my views have undergone some changes, which Chuck was tracking, and to which he gave forward. He gave an account of them, which may do me more justice than I deserve, because they were probably much more ad hoc, these changes over time, than he suggests. But these are the two changes in my view. And the first one, I think he talked about both of them. In fact, I thought of humanitarian intervention as an exceptional act, and even in the 70s, when the examples in front of me were Cambodia, closing down, shutting down the killing fields, Bangladesh, ending the reign of terror in what was then East Pakistan, or Uganda overthrowing the murderous regime of Idi Amin. Even those should have suggested that this was not this was not going to be an exceptional occurrence, or if the interventions were exceptional, the need for intervention would not be exceptional. So there are there are many more instances that seem to call for the use of force across borders to protect the most basic rights and needs of individuals. And I'm not sure I can respond to Nancy's challenge to deal with the case of failed states. I do think that failed states, in the sense of states that cannot provide security or welfare for their inhabitants, or states that are predatory, actively denying welfare and protection to their inhabitants, do justify forceful intervention when there is some prospect of success, and that we have to talk about exactly what that means. And that brings me to the second change in my view. I argued that the test of humanitarian intervention was that the intervening forces went in and quickly came out. They stopped the killing, and they left. And they left so that the processes of self-determination, the political processes, whatever they were in that place, could continue, could take on in an environment of relative nonviolence, could take on their own character. And we now see that was simply an inaccurate description of what these interventions had to be like if they were to have any effectiveness at all. You couldn't just go in and quickly go out. You had to be prepared to stay and at least begin the work of political reconstruction, political and economic reconstruction. And then the question is, what is the end in view of this reconstructive project? And I think that if you go in to stop mass murder, the goal should be the creation of a non-murderous regime. Effectively non-murderous, an effective regime, and a legitimate regime in the sense that it has what I called in the 70s, a fit with its own people, such that it did not require massive coercion to stay in power. And it still seems to me that that should be the aim, the creation of a regime which is sufficiently legitimate so that it doesn't have to use violence to rule, and a regime that is therefore able effectively to rule. Now, if you can do better than that, I would try to do better than that. Yes, if you can create a society where civil liberties and civil rights are respected, if you can create a society where there are constitutional protections for political opposition, if you can create a society that is committed to equal opportunity for its citizens, yes, you should do that. But the goal should be what is necessary is something much more minimal, and I would not. I think those greater goals are in fact very difficult to achieve, as we are learning, as we have learned, and I would not use force to try to achieve them. I think modesty is the proper aim of these kinds of interventions, both because we're likely to do more harm than good if we are immodest in our goals, but also because, for the old reason, that somehow I want to set in process local forms of politics, local forms of self determination. else do I have to deal with? I think I will. Well, I should just say just one very quick word in response to Chuck's question about what is self-determination and why do we value it. I listened to his discussion and I thought that it was helpful, but without a whole series of cases, I can't judge where I would come down with the options that he gave us. I would really need to look. I think we would need to look at some examples. Do we want to say, for example, that the Iranian Revolution of '79 or whatever it was an example of collective self-determination, and is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is in some ways democratic, but imperfectly so, certainly. Is this a fit? Or is this a minimally just regime? Or is this a consultative, hierarchical, or whatever the phrase is? Where does it fit? And you'd have to look at more cases like that, I think, in order to reach any clear conclusions. Thank you.
The floor is open.
Question to Ruthie. I guess I'm following Nancy's puzzle about how seriously to take states and what exactly is meant by that. Sometimes it seemed as if you're proposing to grant states some kind of maybe partial immunity from moral condemnation or moral measures that would otherwise be suitable, but that's not the case, I guess. So the way I understood it, and you can correct this, is just a clarificatory question, is that to take the call to take states seriously is more a call to the state members than to the international community. I mean, the members of a state should kind of restrain themselves in their criticism and in their enthusiasm to, replace the government every time they have some kind of criticism, moral or other. In order for the government to be able to function properly, they need, in a sense, to be more patient. Patient, including towards a moral wrongdoing of the state. Is this what you have in mind, or?
I want to combine an answer to you with an answer to the question raised, I think, very legitimately by Nancy, about what do I mean by a claim of legitimate authority, and am I not returning by that to legitimacy and moral standing, and the whole thing that I wanted to avoid. And it's very interesting that there is an analogy here between states and laws, and you're quite right to point out that it has to do not only with the international community, but also with the inside relationships between states and the people under their jurisdictions. And Kelsen, who is actually one of the fathers of the hope of a world order that will transform all of the world into a law enforcement system, like a state, he actually said that law and state are the same thing. And I think that the law has a claim of legitimate authority. But when we look at a state and we ask questions about its laws, we don't necessarily accept that this claim of legitimate authority is always indeed justified. So this is the case also with states. And I think that what I mean by taking states seriously is indeed true for both the internal and the external levels. And on the internal level, it's very similar to arguments about the prima facie obligation to obey the law. And there is a distinction, it's a huge distinction between criticism. Moral criticism should be free. I mean, some countries are not democratic, they don't allow it. But in terms of my moral theory, criticism is fine. I think that one of the distinctions that Walzer wants to make is that, yes, political philosophers have total freedom to criticize. It's very important that they criticize, but they should, I think, understand that there is a difference between the moral conclusions of their arguments and an immediate call for action to the masses or to the parties or to the authorities. And one of the things about taking states seriously is you have to take seriously the mechanisms that the state identifies as the mechanisms for deciding these issues. Now, if I move to the international arena, and I don't think that there is a huge difference about the limits of humanitarian intervention. I think that the difference is more in the general formulation. I think that when you talk about humanitarian intervention, you stress, to my mind, too much the need to punish bad states, evil states, tyrannical states. My fear is that a more serious problem is failed states, or states that don't have an ability or wish to provide services such as health, education, welfare, protection of human rights, and things like that. And I would like to see an international frame that uses moral condemnation and criticism and economic help and economic sanctions in a more integrated fashion, not to only punish states, but to help states perform their obligation towards their citizens and towards the global order. I would like to see a more constructive view of states as needing help to perform better, stressing more not the rights of other states to intervene, but the duties of states towards their populations. I think it's a much healthier building of a theory of international relations.
While people think, Chuck, would you like a moment to
I wanted to answer a
Nancy?
question that Nancy raised, if I could. It's a good question, and it gives me a chance to talk about a case. Nancy asked if this was a question about my view, not my interpretation of Michael's, that whether I thought that there were two grounds for humanitarian intervention, one of which was gross mistreatment of a population by its government, and the other was whether a failure of self-determination could itself justify intervention, whether self-determination could be a value to be promoted through intervention as well as a value to be respected by not intervening. And in a paragraph in the paper that I didn't read, I talk a little bit about the case of the U.S. Intervention in Haiti in the early 1990s, and I think in one respect, it's just not a very good case because it's so eccentric. I mean, small country close to American borders. It took a minimal force to intervene, and then it turned out the authoritarian government collapsed before the Americans got their feet on the ground. And so, it wasn't. You might say it was not the modal case of humanitarian intervention. But it's interesting for the following reason. It's not interesting in the context of thinking about Michael's views, and I'd be kind of curious about what Michael thinks about this. It's a case that seems to me impossible to justify under the standards for humanitarian intervention in the book and in moral standing. But it's an intervention that it seems to me very plausible to think was all right. And the argument, put sort of, briefly, that it makes me think it's easy to think it was all right, was that here was a case where a recently established, more or less democratic government in a country without a history of democracy and with it wasn't really arguable that it had a democratic culture, but here was a country that had recently established a democratic government and elected a president, in which its military usurped authority and governing power and kicked out the president. But it didn't. And although they weren't nice guys, this was not a case of massacre or enslavement. And yet, it seems to me there was an argument there, and the argument for intervention was that intervention promoted self-determination in a more morally meaningful way by restoring a democratically elected leader. And the the reason why I think it's interesting is that if there was any adjective that could be applied to the political culture, it would have been more like authoritarian than democratic. So it wasn't a case of reestablishing a lost fit. It was a case of advancing a substantively significant conception of self-determination in a society in which, looked at from the perspective of its own time, maybe less so from now, looked like a modest expenditure of military force might bring about a sort of, an improvement, a political improvement in the quality of government. So I think it's an interesting case, and it makes me think that one wanted to sort of have a systematic view about this, that probably the answer to your question ought to be yes, but sort of always subject to these very important, sort of instrumental caveats that it's hard to do, and there's very few cases that are going to be like the Haitian case. The local obstacles to success, especially the success of military power, are likely to be large. It's likely to be very difficult to control the consequences of intervention after it's happened. So it's always seemed to me that in real political arguments about intervention, the hard judgments are always these matters of sort of political and military calculation. They're seldom ones about whether a principle of moral standing allows or doesn't allow intervention. The Haitian case is one, I think, where that principle actually makes a difference, how you construe that principle.
Wouldn't you say, though, that this is ex post? Because, in fact, the consequences of the invasion were not catastrophic in themselves. But say all of these things would have been there, and you went in, and for some reason, the outcome of that would have been devastating. Then probably you would say the theory was quite wise to suggest that this was not a case for intervention. So this is simply, isn't it?
Well, uncertainty works symmetrically. It works symmetrically against deciding to act and deciding not to act. And uncertainty varies by case. I think that was a case where it was reasonable to think at the time that invasion sort of glorifies it, but the sort of modest application of military force that took place was reasonably likely to accomplish its goals. And the way in which the intervention actually happened increased one's confidence that would happen. So, I don't know. These political judgments are always made from a perspective in time, and for this one, it seems to me it was a reasonable guess that it would work. But I agree with you. If it's not clear, if there's reasons to think that the local obstacles are more substantial, or that more power is required, or that there are, when I say it's an eccentric case, I think it's not. I think that in most cases in which intervention to promote self-determination might seem appealing from certain points of view, it's likely that the practical obstacles are going to be enough to explain why it shouldn't be tried.
I want to ask you a question, though, because it seemed in your early writing that you were suggesting intervention in cases where now you probably would not suggest them. For instance, in case of serious problems of distributive justice or problems with the status of women. So it seemed in the early work that you took humanitarian intervention and human rights or universalism sufficiently, you gave it sufficient weight to justify intervention even in those kinds of cases, which I found a bit disturbing.
To tell the truth, I think I've actually written very little about humanitarian military intervention.
Except
when it's been in response, sort of critical of other people's views. And in the cases, I've never advocated intervention to bring about distributive justice. Although, there are cases that you might describe, I wouldn't, but you might describe as ones of distributive justice where I think it might, Somalia in a certain way might be thought of as that, although it's really one of just meeting the basic needs. The case of women's rights is more complicated, and this is where it makes a difference whether the issue is military intervention or some generic kind of interference. I think the women's rights question is really interesting and very complicated, and I can't think of a case where I would think that military intervention made sense. But I can think of a variety of cases where various forms of interference along the lines you describe, sort of, often carried out by, NGOs or, forms of political action that take place in transnational civil society would be justified, but I could imagine an argument against them from the perspective of somebody who took the moral status of states very seriously. So I think they're interesting cases, but they're not particularly interesting about military intervention.
There was
I
a
think
question.
Michael was
Oh.
saying something else.
I defended that intervention. I thought it was a counter-intervention, reflexive counter-intervention. We had played a major role in creating the authoritarian political culture of Haiti. We had played a major role in propping up the previous regime. And so it didn't seem to me wrong for us to intervene, so to speak, against ourselves and try to give the Haitians some room for a genuine self-determination, which was not what had been going on in Haiti before. So that's just, that is a way of putting it under the categories of just and unjust wars.
It's a novel use of the idea of the nation as the living, the dead, and the yet unborn.
There was a question in the back.
Situation, the state could be failed or authoritarian, but to me, and all that is whatever seeks its own level, sometimes rings true. And if people have a culture, this is obviously a very extreme view that I'm not share at all, but if people have a culture that developed over centuries that leads to this outcome, then at least it should be recognized to what degree or discussed to what degree they are responsible for their own failed state or authoritarian state. That's not to preclude any form of intervention, but all I'm trying to say is that responsibility may be shared. Maybe people have a responsibility for their own failed outcome or undesirable outcome, and we ought to be as much as honest enough to make that statement.
Anyone in particular? That was. No, I meant any. Would you like?
I would just sound like Michael on this. I think we have to know which are the cases that we have in mind because, it's not logically, you could imagine a case that sort of fits your description of a culture that had been relatively free of external influence over time and that had developed in such a way that the state apparatus failed in whatever sense of failure you're thinking about. But it seems to me when I think about places where there really is state failure, where we worry, the Central African cases, for example, it's hard to think of one where the story is a story about a kind of indigenous culture that's been around for a long time and that just is sort of politically corrupt and incompetent and its institutions are just failing. It's not. These are places where the political map that constitutes the state was drawn by Europeans, where the political dynamics and even some of what now appear to us to be ethnic conflicts were deeply influenced by colonial and by colonial policies and by the terms of decolonization. They're ones where it's very hard to think about the society as, to use a phrase I once used, as relatively self-enclosed arenas of political development. They're ones that are part of a larger set of global forces, and there's no question that there's an indigenous component to the explanation of the way that the forms of political development or the failure of political development that we observe, but to think of them in the way that you describe them and that would support a kind of attribution of responsibility to the members of that society, I think in the cases that we really worry about is just likely to be unrealistic. It's not to say there might not actually be cases like that. Who's the they?
Why not describe it as part of the donor's responsibilities? That the donors altered the domestic distribution of power and resources and authority by, often deliberately, as in the case of Mobutu, deliberately channeling resources to one part of the society that would come to dominate over others. That's not a domestic indigenous fact. That's a fact about how the external states chose to interact with the domestic system.
Also, in addition, I mean, okay, you say it's their responsibility. It may be their responsibility, but as international community members who are interested, A, in the welfare of these people, and B, in the stability of the world order, we don't stop at saying that it's their responsibility. We think of creative ways in which to help them to create an effective state that will provide them with welfare. And, you know, how to do it and how to try and get forces within those societies to do most of the work and things like that are very, very important and critical questions of international relations. But I don't think that they are questions about the moral standing of states.
Itzhak had encouraged me to take my chair's hat off and talk about Chuck's paper for a minute, rightly thinking that there would be things that I would find engaging in it. I want to suggest a little bit of a historical perspective on the difference between the Society of States model and the Society of Peoples models. The Society of States model is the model of social contract theory and classical natural jurisprudence in the Grotian model, where all there is the state, and if the state dissolves, then there is no people behind it. The Society of Peoples in the 19th century up through the era of decolonization was a revolutionary principle, the principle of remaking the international order to fit this new nationalist conception of what the world should look like. But it seems to me that in the post-UN, post-decolonization era, of which Michael is offering a reading and an interpretation, and I think a fairly accurate one, the imputation to existing states of peoplehood is a premise that is accorded tremendous, tremendous weight. That the UN, like Michael, looks at states after decolonization and says, it will take a tremendous amount to convince us that really existing states are not manifestations of the right of peoples to self-determination. Because after all, we have said all peoples have a right to self-determination, and almost every square inch of land on the inhabited globe is now carved up into states, each of which have one vote in the United Nations and the General Assembly. The old Society of States model gets infused with this new moral purpose, which is the claim that each of them represents something domestic in a people that has a pre-political existence. I mean, it's empirically dubious and difficult to say that this normative ideal is also normal in the world, but it is the premise that the UN system rests on. And I think what you're asking Michael to do, to pull them apart, to pull apart the normative and the normal here, and look at the world and say, look how little self-determination of peoples there really is in the states of the world. That asks more than the theory can bear, and you remain a critic outside, not someone who is really offering an account that can be internalized within the theory.
I'm not sure about the outside-inside part, but I don't think that. I think that if your comments are kind of about the current status of international legal doctrine, I just don't read it as being that clear. I mean, the charter conception before the human rights treaties really is a conception of states. It's a conception under which territorial integrity and political sovereignty are the fundamental values. The Declaration of Human Rights, which came only 3 years after the Charter, doesn't contain any reference to self-determination. It's the two human rights conventions, which started to be written during that time, but weren't finished until, weren't approved by the General Assembly until 1966, and they didn't have enough ratifications to enter into force until 10 years later. Those are where self-determination, in identical articles, where self-determination is identified as an independent value, And it was identified as an independent value just because it was needed to justify the political realignments of the period of decolonization. So, I think what we have I'm no expert on charter law, but I think what we have in Ruth is, so I should let her speak, but I think what we have is not a seamless, consistent pattern of principles. We have a statist conception overlain by an ideal of some kind of self-determination, and what's left open famously open in the legal instruments is who the selves are who are allowed to determine. And even in the period of decolonization, who were the selves? They weren't. Some were peoples, but most weren't. Most were colonies. And whether or not there was a people inside that colony was a kind of a historical contingency that was mostly not borne out by the facts. So I think that the international doctrinal situation is just unclear. And, I think one of the things that a critical political theory does is, in the case of these unclarities, is to try to figure out what the reasons are that might lead us to resolve the ambiguities one way or another, and to think about how the principles apply in hard cases.
I want to add that because this is actually extremely interesting. The principle of self-determination in terms of peoples is a Wilsonian principle of the end of the First World War after the collapse of the empires. Now what we are seeing, and then you had a regime of national minority rights that was a total failure, created a lot of upheaval, was one of the incentives to the Second World War because of the German minorities in Silesia and Czechoslovakia, and resulted in the fact that there were almost no recognition of group rights after World War II. Now you have a slow and fascinating development of the recognition of group rights that is becoming extremely important and is now rephrased in terms of self-determination, rights to cultures, sub-state, state self-determination, and the question that you were talking about, which is question of minority rights and the tension between claims of individuals, states, cohesiveness of states, and minority rights is returning, in fact, to the Second World War situation, especially with the problems that you were talking about of immigration and the kinds of different nations and the claims of indigenous peoples and the need for states now to maintain civil rest and find that minorities will not be subversive and there will not be unsettling of national borders by the name of self-determination of the Wilsonian part is now reappearing, and you really don't have the conceptions to deal with that. And here again, I think that Michael's categories, types of states, are designed to give states the power to figure out how to balance civic cohesion and autonomy of cultures and peoples within them for very different groups of minority, majority, unstable minority, majority, minority here and majority there. Fascinating situations with interesting histories, Kurds all over the place in different states. I think it proves that you cannot really think of these things in general. You must look at the details. That political solutions must be political solutions that will work, and to work, they must be suited to the circumstances on the ground.
I believe that we are out of time. We adjourn for 15 minutes for coffee, and we'll resume at 4:50. 4:30. 4:30, okay.